The greatest horror wasn't what was missing. It was the story the doorframe told me. Welcome to Mr. Nightmare. I am the investigator who opens the files you shouldn't see. The case I brought you to begins in a high-rise apartment on the north side of Chicago. A sterile, expensive glass tower where people value anonymity over community. The official report said the tenants, a young couple, simply missed their rent and moved out overnight. But the building manager, a man who had seen too many secrets, knew better. I stood in the doorway of the 34th floor unit and the air was wrong. Everything was meticulously clean, staged for a quick sale, yet a suffocating cold hung in the silence. The tension was immediate. No signs of a struggle, no blood, no forced entry. The apartment was pristine, but the tenants were gone. I moved past the granite countertop and the empty stainless steel appliances, searching for the crack in the facade. I finally found it near the master bedroom. It wasn't obvious. You had to look closely, but once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. Etched deep into the lacquered wood of the door frame just above the latch were 3 distinct, vertical gouges. These weren't the accidental marks of moving furniture. They were deep, deliberate scratch marks applied with intense final pressure, the desperate physical scream of someone trying to hold on to the last piece of structural reality before being pulled away. The mark was raw, clear proof that a struggle had occurred, violent and instantaneous despite the spotless carpet and the neat absence of any other clues. This single piece of physical evidence shattered the moved-out theory. The gouges proved that the final moments of the couple's occupancy were marked by extreme terror. I spent minutes analyzing the marks, realizing that the victim's fingers or a desperate tool had clawed into the frame, trying to leave an indelible record. The greatest paradox was the quiet that followed the struggle. How could a desperate final fight happen and leave no witnesses? No neighbors reporting a single sound in a building where the walls are paper-thin. The terrifying answer was clear. The attacker was someone close, someone who knew the routine, and someone who executed the plan with such speed and psychological control that the victim's last act was to leave a hidden, frantic message for anyone who dared to look closely at the framework of their life. The apartment was silent, but the wooden frame was screaming the truth of what happened in the dark. The agonizing final scratch mark near the master bedroom, Part 1, told me what happened in those desperate final moments, but the building itself told me why the crime was perfect. The greatest tragedy of this case is that the victims lived in a high-rise tower, a symbol of modern security and success, yet they were trapped in the most profound isolation imaginable. This wasn't horizontal isolation like a cabin in the woods. This was vertical isolation, a unique flaw of urban life that the predator exploited perfectly. I walked the sterile, brightly lit hallways, realizing the true nature of the environment. The building boasted 24-hour security, keycard access, and cameras, a fortress of modernity. Yet no one knew the names of the people living next door, above, or below. That absolute anonymity, that collective indifference was the fatal flaw. The structural reality of these urban towers provided the killer with a unique tactical advantage. Their lives were separated from their killer only by a thin layer of drywall and a concrete slab. I analyzed the blueprints, recognizing that every wall, every shared vent, and every vertical utility tunnel was a potential avenue for surveillance. The ceiling of their unit was the floor of the killer, and the floor of their unit was the ceiling of the killer. This architectural flaw meant that the threat was not from outside, but from a neighbor who had the perfect vantage point to study their routines, their weakest moments, and their schedule. I deduced the killer was not a random intruder. The killer was a meticulous observer who lived within the anonymity of the structure itself. The vulnerability of the victims was rooted in their own trust in the system. They were a young, professional couple, focused on careers reliant on technology, and entirely conditioned to believe that their high rent and secured doors provided absolute safety. They believed the only threat came from the ground floor. They never considered the threat from the ceiling. They were unaware that the constant low-level urban noise, the muffled music, the shouts, the strange thuds from above, was the sound of indifference. That soundscape was the predator's shield. In this city of stacked lives, people are trained to ignore the sounds of conflict. They rationalize disturbances as someone else's business, ensuring that any actual scream would be dismissed as just another noisy neighbor. This collective social agreement was the killer's silent accomplice. guaranteeing that the frantic struggle indicated by the scratches would go unreported. The killer leveraged this vertical isolation not only for surveillance but potentially for access. I had to investigate the possibility that the predator used the building's hidden infrastructure, the maintenance shafts, the ventilation systems, or the utility rooms, as a silent network to move between floors and access the apartment complex without using the hallways or elevators. The anonymity of the vertical structure meant the killer could stalk the victims for months, knowing their schedule, their points of weakness, and the precise moment when they were most vulnerable. The perfect crime in the modern city isn't committed by a stranger who breaks a window. It is committed by the ultimate insider, the neighbor who moves with impunity through the building's own unseen arteries, using the architecture of modern life as a weapon. Chicago is a city of concrete and glass, a place where everything is sealed and artificially preserved. When I had grown accustomed to the raw horror of the claw marks on the doorframe, Part 1, my brain, soothed by the apartment's near-sterile cleanliness, started searching for an anchor. It was looking for something logical to push back against the sheer terror. And I found it. Not in the bedroom, but in the living area, near the balcony overlooking Lake Michigan. It was a vast window, floor to ceiling, facing the glittering expanse of the city view, but instead of a flawless pane, I saw a hastily bandaged wound right in the center. The window had been shattered, not struck from the outside but fractured by a violent force delivered from the inside. The cracks radiated outwards from a central impact point, forming a perfect spiderweb of desperation. Yet the truly chilling detail was not the break itself, but how it had been treated. Someone, likely one of the victims, had immediately used wide, brown packing tape to seal the wound shut, covering it top to bottom in a hurried but thorough fashion. It wasn't a temporary patch. It was an emergency muzzle. The broken window rule, I murmured, recalling the criminological theory that a small flaw, left unrepaired, leads to greater chaos. But here was the paradox. The flaw had occurred and someone had rushed to hide it instantly. Why would they break the window? To draw attention? To scream for help to the world outside, hundreds of feet below the passing car lights? Or did they break it to get out? I reached out and touched the cold, aged tape. Behind it was the apartment's unsettling silence. In front, the dizzying depth of the void. This was the first clear sign of a violent explosion. A moment of acute conflict that I had utterly missed. Had I seen this first, I would have known this wasn't a simple disappearance, but I hadn't. And worse, looking closely through the adhesive, I realized something crucial. A specific, small shard of glass had been removed from the sill. A vital piece was gone. I began to wonder, what was broken and why was it muzzled immediately after? A profound chill set in. I knew the person who had silenced this window was the same person who was trying to silence the truth within these very walls. The detective and the property manager left, their steps fading into the sterile quiet of the hallway, taking their rationalizations with them. Their denial only fueled my conviction. The truth wasn't missing. It was deliberately hidden. I needed to stop looking for signs of their struggle and start looking for signs of the killer's rules. I went back to the master bedroom, the epicenter of the psychological damage. While the police focused on the obvious, the claw marks, the missing couple, I focused on what was left behind. On the bedside table, half hidden beneath a stack of paperback novels, was the core evidence I'd been searching for. It wasn't a bloody weapon or a ransom note. It was a small, leather-bound moleskin notebook, the kind people use for private thoughts or daily journaling. But this was no journal. Inside, the pages were filled not with dates or anecdotes, but with meticulous handwritten entries, all in the same neat, almost obsessive script. Across the top of the first page, written in bold capital letters, was the title. The 7 Rules. I felt a dizzying wave of cold realization wash over me. The Hays didn't just live in fear. They were living under a terrifyingly systematic, self-imposed code. They hadn't disappeared suddenly. They had been operating within a set of protocols designed for survival. The notes detailed 7 distinct rules, each with specific behavioral directives. They range from the unsettling to the truly paranoid. Rule 1. Never answer after midnight. Assume the knock is not for you. Do not breathe. Wait for the elevator sound. Rule 3. Always check the air vents. Must be sealed with masking tape before sleep. Listen for the drag. Rule 5. The lost key protocol. If a key is dropped outside the door, do not retrieve it. It is a lie. Call a different building, then wait 4 hours. Rule 7. Never stop looking up. The threat is always vertical. My hands trembled as I read. This was a dialogue, a horrifying secret communication between the victims and the shadow that haunted them. This wasn't just fear. This was coexistence. The couple wasn't afraid of the city's dangers. They were afraid of this building. But the most disturbing detail wasn't a rule at all. It was on the final page, written in a different, frantic hand. Mrs. Hayes's script, I guessed. And it was only a fragment, violently smeared with ink. He knows the code. He knows the code. We broke. The writing stopped mid-word. R for rule. They had broken one of the rules, and whatever mechanism of survival they had established had instantly failed. I held the notebook, its leather cold and slick. This was my compass into the psychological abyss. I knew then that the killer was not a random intruder. They were someone who was intimately familiar with the Hayes routines and perhaps was even using these very rules against them. The 7 rules were not the victim's shield. They were a blueprint for their demise, and now they were all I had. With the 7 rules clutched in my hand, Part 5, the apartment transformed from a crime scene into a battlefield post-mortem. The notebook proved the Hayes couple wasn't surprised. They were prepared. They had been waiting for the attack, operating under a siege mentality. This changed everything. I stopped looking for signs of a break-in and started looking for evidence of a controlled operation. I moved to the small utility closet where the building's wiring infrastructure was routed. The key paradox of the whole scene kept nagging at me. If the attack was so violent it produced deep claw marks in a shattered window, why was there no distress call? Why did the building manager and police not receive a single automated alert? I opened the panel. The tangle of wires was typical of an older Chicago high-rise. Phone lines, Ethernet cables, and coaxial TV lines bundled together. Everything looked functional. Then I saw it. The main analog phone line, the copper pair leading directly to the old-school wall jack, the kind that connects to traditional landline phones and emergency 911, had been cut. Not ripped out violently during a struggle, but precisely severed with a pair of side cutters. The break was clean, intentional, and surgical. Silence, I whispered. Absolute silence. But here was the terrifying paradox. The internet modem and the main power line were perfectly intact. The power was still running, providing light to the clean, empty rooms. The Wi-Fi router was blinking its cheerful green light, meaning data was flowing, and their digital lives, emails, social media, apps were completely operational right up until they vanished. If the assailant wanted to cut off communication, why only the hardwired emergency line? Why leave the internet functional? The very conduit they could have used to make a silent, frantic text or VoIP call. The answer hit me with the force of a physical blow, connecting back to the vertical isolation of the high-rise. Part 2. The killer didn't want the Hayes to be cut off from the world. The killer wanted them to be cut off from help that travels via official channels. A cellular 911 call could be traced to a tower, but a traditional landline call pinpoints the exact address, apartment 34B. By cutting the analog line, the killer eliminated the most reliable way to summon immediate police assistance. Leaving the power and Wi-Fi active was a masterstroke of psychological torture. It meant the Hayes could still see the outside world, could still feel the agonizing presence of their digital connection, but they were trapped. They could try to text or email, but those communications are delayed, unprioritized, and easily dismissed as non-emergencies, just another piece of annoying paperwork for the police to ignore. Part 4. The unused emergency line wasn't a failure of the victim. It was the chilling signature of the killer. It confirmed my theory. This was a calculated, controlled capture, and the killer's goal was not brute force but absolute, deniable silence. They wanted to ensure that when the conflict erupted, the outside world heard nothing but the gentle hum of the city's indifferent systems. I knew the killer sought absolute silence, Part 6, but the Hayes couple, guided by the 7 rules, Part 5, must have had one final contingency. I returned to the bedroom closet, a place the police had dismissed as merely storage. Hidden deep beneath a pile of winter clothes was a small, waterproof digital recorder. It was the type used by hikers or investigative journalists, designed to be durable and crucially to record continuously until manually stopped. It wasn't a video log, but an audio one. The exterior casing was scraped and dented, as if it had been thrown or dropped hard. I immediately connected it to my laptop. The file was corrupted badly, but with my forensic software I managed to salvage the final, critical 3 minutes of audio. The initial 2 minutes were just ambient apartment noise, the distant drone of Chicago traffic, the muffled sound of the building's HVAC system, and low, anxious whispering. I could barely make out Mr. Hayes' voice. Just ignore it. We follow Rule 1. It's after midnight, remember? We wait for the elevator sound, then we know it's gone. The recording then shifted. A sudden tense gasp from Mrs. Hayes, followed by a frantic shuffle of cloth. The ambient noise was interrupted by a new, utterly chilling sound. A soft, rhythmic scraping coming from what sounded like the other side of a thin wall. Then, Mrs. Hayes' voice, sharp and terrified, cutting through the silence. It's not the elevator. It's vertical. Did you check the vents? We broke Rule 7. You didn't tape the bathroom vent. A metallic thud, the sound of something heavy hitting the floor. Then a rush of movement followed by a muffled, desperate shout from Mr. Hayes. I have to open it. It's the only way to signal. I froze. Open what? He must have been talking about the window, part 3. He broke the glass to signal in a final act of desperation. But Mrs. Hayes' last terrified words were the key. We broke Rule 7. Rule 7 from the notebook. Never stop looking up. The threat is always vertical. The threat wasn't someone outside the apartment trying to get in. It was someone already inside the building's infrastructure, moving vertically through the walls or vents. The moment they failed to seal the vents, Rule 3, they had violated Rule 7 and triggered the assault. The final 30 seconds were a crescendo of pure terror, a heavy, wet impact sound. A choked cry cut short, and then a sound that made me physically recoil from my laptop. A faint, satisfied humming, not belonging to either victim, quickly fading out, replaced by the sound of something being dragged across a smooth surface. The audio file ended abruptly, with the chilling scrape of tape being rapidly pulled from a roll, suggesting the quick, calculated sealing of the window just moments after the physical conflict concluded. This was my turning point. I finally had the truth. The Hayes were killed not by a random street criminal, but by a predator who lived in the building's own vertical isolation, a killer who knew their rules and attacked the very moment they broke them. The recovered audio log, Part 7, was my smoking gun, but it also became a crippling psychological weapon pointed directly at me. The final soft humming, a sound of satisfaction, and the warning, the threat is always vertical, meant I was hunting someone who lived in this very stack of concrete, either above or below. I started with the neighbors directly below apartment 34B, Mr. Silas. Mr. Silas was an older man, a retired auditor who lived alone. When I first knocked, he answered the door with a perfectly timed delay, just long enough to suggest he was checking the peephole, but not so long as to seem paranoid. He was the picture of a harmless, isolated high-rise tenant, but his answers were too clean, too precise. Did you hear anything unusual the night the Hayes disappeared? I asked, holding the small notebook of the 7 rules. No, investigator, he replied, adjusting his spectacles. I always wear my noise-canceling headphones after 10 p.m. I value my quiet. In a building this high, you learn to filter out the noise. He was speaking my language, the language of vertical isolation, Part 2. He had weaponized his own anonymity. The real crisis hit when I asked him about the Hayes' routines. He knew everything. Mr. Hayes' predictable morning gym time, Mrs. Hayes' late-night calls to her sister, even the exact brand of aromatic air freshener they used that sometimes drifted through the shared ventilation shaft. You seem to know a lot about their habits, I pressed, my heart rate accelerating. He smiled, a thin, cold, completely unreadable smile. In an environment this structured, investigator patterns are everything. If you don't track your neighbor's patterns, you won't recognize when your own pattern is being tracked. It's the 8th rule of high-rise living, one they clearly hadn't learned. The sheer arrogance of that statement, suggesting he knew more about survival than the victims, was unnerving. But the final terrifying piece was visual. While he spoke, I glanced behind him into his immaculate living room. On a small table next to a precise stack of financial ledgers was a single new roll of wide brown packing tape, the exact type used to muzzle the broken window in the Hayes apartment. Part 3. I looked at his calm face, then at the tape, then back to his eyes. He didn't flinch. The air was thick with unspoken knowledge. I couldn't prove he was the killer, but I was certain he was the observer. He was the shadow who knew the code. Part 5. I stood there paralyzed, realizing I was having a terrifying conversation with a man who viewed murder not as an act of passion, but as a meticulous, predictable auditing process. The paranoia wasn't just in the building. It was closing in around me. I had found my ghost and he knew I was looking. The terrifying composure of Mr. Silas, coupled with his intimate knowledge of the Hayes life and his roll of packing tape, Part 8, gave me the answer I needed but not the evidence I could present in court. I had to prove the vertical threat wasn't a metaphor. I had to expose the killer's routine. I left Mr. Silas's apartment, my mind racing. If the threat was vertical, Rule 7, and he had used the building's infrastructure, he needed access. Not just a key, but an understanding of the structure itself. I convinced building maintenance that there was a potential mold issue, requiring an emergency inspection of the maintenance shafts running adjacent to the Hayes' apartment. 34B. What I found confirmed my darkest fears. The maintenance shaft was a hollow vertical cavity that ran from the basement to the roof, containing all the building's essential utilities, plumbing, electrical conduits, and, crucially, the HVAC venting system. Hidden between the 33rd and 34th floors and again between the 34th and 35th were tiny unsealed access panels, small enough for a slender person to slip through. These panels were meant to be locked, but here, the lock mechanisms had been neatly filed down. Inside the crawl space near the 34th floor level, the revelation hit me like a physical punch, scraped into the dust and grime. Just inches from the main ventilation conduit leading directly to the Hayes' bathroom and kitchen were minute, almost imperceptible scuff marks, and next to those the indisputable evidence, a series of small, dried condensation rings indicating that someone had been sitting there, pressed against the inner wall of the apartment, for long periods patiently watching. But the final, nauseating detail was an item left behind. A small, personalized earpiece connected to a miniaturized microphone, the type of gear a security guard or an auditor might use to record ambient sound or discreet conversations. The truth crystallized. The killer was not a stranger who broke in. He was an insider. He had been utilizing the building's common spaces, the utility shafts, the ventilation systems, the very bones of the high-rise, as his personal surveillance network. He wasn't relying on technology. He was relying on proximity and patience. He didn't just know their routines. He lived their routines, moving silently through the walls. The ghost wasn't a supernatural entity. It was a man who used the vertical architecture of the building to make himself invisible. The Hayes couple, in their final moments, broke Rule 7 because they assumed the threat was coming from the vents. They were wrong. The predator wasn't coming from the vertical space. He was already there. My conclusion was definitive. The murderer was not only a tenant of the building but a meticulous, systemic voyeur, the ultimate embodiment of vertical isolation. And I knew exactly who it was. I had the killer's method, Part 9. I had their motive, systemic voyeurism, and I had their identity, Mr. Silas, the meticulous auditor from downstairs. I had the 7 rules, the claw marks, the severed phone line, and the haunting audio log. I had everything but the one thing the legal system demands, the corpus delicti, the body. My final action was to confront Detective Miller, Part 4, one last time. I presented him with my full findings, the file-down lock on the maintenance shaft, the condensation rings proving long-term surveillance, and the audio recording pinpointing the exact moment the Hayes broke Rule 7 and sealed their fate. Miller listened patiently, his pen tapping slowly against his notepad. When I finished, he didn't look impressed. He looked sympathetic, which was worse. "Investigator, this is a brilliant piece of psychological profiling," he admitted, slowly shaking his head. "It's a chilling narrative. You've proven the Hayes were terrified and you found a very suspicious neighbor. But what do we have? A few scuff marks in a communal shaft, An old guy with packing tape and an audio file where a couple talks about rules before a loud noise. It's not enough. He pushed the moleskin notebook containing the 7 rules back toward me. The defense attorney will argue they used this notebook to write a horror screenplay. They will argue the claw marks were from a dog. They will argue Mr. Silas is just an eccentric who carries tape. We can harass him, yes, but we can't charge him with murder. The failure wasn't due to incompetence. It was due to the calculated nature of the crime. Silas, the auditor, had removed all the variables. He hadn't just killed them. He had processed their disappearance. He used the ATM for the withdrawal, drove the minivan a short distance and abandoned it, making it look like a runaway couple, and, most sickeningly, removed the bodies without leaving a trace of blood or forensic evidence. He had leveraged the city's vertical isolation against me. There were 1,000 places in the dense grid of Chicago where a body could disappear forever. The abandoned sections of the subway, the deepest parts of the lake, or simply incinerated elsewhere. You're telling me, I said, my voice barely a whisper, that even with this overwhelming psychological and circumstantial proof, we can't get an indictment? I'm telling you, Miller said, meeting my gaze, we don't have a murder. We have a missing persons case with extreme paranoia, and until a body surfaces, Mr. Silas goes home tonight perfectly free. He made sure the city saw a disappearance, not a crime. I realized then the ultimate price of my investigation. I had solved the case and learned the truth about the urban predator, but I had failed the Hayes couple. I knew the killer's identity, I knew his method, but the legal system was powerless. I had given him the ultimate victory, deniability. I left the station that night, knowing that Mr. Silas was not only walking free, but was likely already observing the new occupants of his former victim's apartment, secure in the knowledge that his methodology was legally unsolvable. Detective Miller was right. Without the corpus delicti, Mr. Silas walked free. My psychological profile, no matter how precise, was just a chilling theory. The legal system required a body. The city only required a new tenant. The Hayes' apartment, 34B, was cleaned, repainted, and relisted within 3 months. The broken window had been replaced with sparkling, flawless glass. The claw marks were sanded down and vanished under a fresh coat of eggshell white paint. The apartment was once again a perfect symbol of vertical isolation and expensive anonymity. But I knew the truth, and that knowledge was the Hayes' true legacy. The apartment quickly gained a reputation among the building staff. It was haunted. New tenants never stayed long. A young couple moved in, complained of strange drafts and faint rhythmic tapping coming from the ceiling, and broke their lease after a month. A single businessman took over, claiming he heard unidentified humming echoing in his bedroom late at night. The same sound I heard at the end of the audio log, Part 7. The irony was profound. The apartment wasn't haunted by the souls of the dead. It was haunted by the knowledge of how to survive them. The terror wasn't supernatural. It was methodological. The strange drafts were air currents moving through the subtly compromised ventilation shafts, Part 9. The tapping was Silas, the silent auditor, resuming his predator's routine in the maintenance crawlspace above or below. The humming was the sound of his continued casual observation. I kept the leather-bound moleskin containing the 7 rules. It was my artifact, the terrifying inheritance left behind by the victims. I realized that the rules themselves were not flawed. They were a desperate logical response to an unseen systemic threat. I never spoke about the rules to the new tenants, but I didn't have to. The environment itself forced the fear upon them. They would instinctively start checking their locks, jump at unexpected noises, and grow increasingly paranoid about the quiet man who lived a few floors away, the man who knew their patterns before they even formed. The Hayes couple might be physically gone, but their final desperate protocols, the code, had been passed on. Every new occupant who felt that prickle of fear, who decided to wear earplugs to bed, or who suddenly felt compelled to check the air vent, was unknowingly adopting one of the 7 rules. The apartment wasn't cursed. It was educated, and the ghost haunting it was not a victim, but the perfectly free, meticulous predator who watched his victims willingly descend into the paranoia that was meant to save them. The case of the Hayes couple remains officially unsolved. A voluntary disappearance filed away under anomaly, extreme paranoia. But for me, the verdict is definitive. And it is the most terrifying one of all. The horror isn't that a sophisticated killer walked free. It's that the system that failed to convict him is the same system we trust with our lives. We are taught that danger lurks in the crowded, visible places, the dark alleyways, the subway cars, the streets at night. The Hayes couple proved that the real terror lies in the perfect anonymity of modern high-rise living. The city offers us freedom from our neighbors, but it also gives the predator absolute control over the spaces between us, the ventilation shafts, the utility closets, the thin layers of drywall that separate our most private moments from his meticulous surveillance. My phobia is no longer focused on what lies outside the window, but on what lies within the walls. Mr. Silas used the building's vertical isolation not as a barrier, but as a silent, personalized hunting blind. He wasn't breaking into their home. He was already living inside it, observing them until they broke one of their own rules, triggering his controlled attack. The 7 Rules, Part 5, were a desperate final warning, a map of the new urban wilderness. And while the world sees a clean, luxury apartment where a couple simply moved on, I see the truth, an environment where the victim's fear became the killer's greatest asset. So here is my final verdict. The chilling lesson I learned while searching for bodies that were never meant to be found. The greatest danger is not the stranger on the street. It is the silent, methodical neighbor who lives 1 floor above or 1 floor below. Don't look down at the city lights. Don't look out at the chaos. If you live in a tower of glass and steel, if you cherish your privacy, if you think you're safe in your perfectly sealed environment, I challenge you. Never stop looking up. Because the quiet predator knows your home. He knows your routine, and he's already there. The sticky brown packing tape covering the spiderweb fracture in the glass, Part 3, felt like an accusation I was shouting into a void. Yet outside this small contained horror, or, as the authorities insisted, this voluntary missing persons case, the world was determined to keep the glass whole. My initial investigative battle wasn't with a killer. It was with the Chicago Police Department's Detective Miller and the building's ever-smiling property manager, Evelyn. They were the gatekeepers of normalcy, armed with standard procedure and corporate apathy. Look, investigator, Miller sighed, clearly annoyed at having his paperwork interrupted. He leaned against the doorframe, a man desperate for a simple, mundane solution. We've been over this. The couple, Mr. and Mrs. Hayes, they paid their rent through the 1st of next month. Their bank accounts show a large withdrawal, cash, at an ATM near Midway Airport 2 days after the reported date of the incident. Their minivan is gone from the garage. He paused, making a sweeping gesture towards the luxurious but silent apartment, packed up and moved on. Moved on? My voice was tight, thin with contained rage. They moved on so spontaneously that they left their medication on the counter, their passports in the safe, and, Detective, are you looking at these? Left desperate fingernail-deep claw marks on the inside of the master bedroom door. They were trying to claw their way out of that room. Evelyn, the property manager, immediately interjected with her unsettlingly cheerful corporate demeanor, clutching a clipboard like a religious shield. They were a very private couple, prone to impulsive decisions. Maybe they took a spontaneous extended trip. The claw marks? She offered a dismissive laugh. Probably just a little renovation damage from a clumsy contractor a few months back that hadn't been filed on my log yet. We see things like that all the time in these high-rises, you know. The air thickened with my frustration. I was standing in the middle of a screaming psychological horror, and they were trying to wallpaper over it with routine and bureaucratic denial. This wasn't just the vertical isolation from the street. It was the chilling isolation of fact from perception. They were doing everything to rationalize the violence. The clear signs of internal struggle were damage. The sudden, total radio silence was privacy. The missing minivan and ATM withdrawal were impulsiveness. And the violently shattered and taped window, Part 3, which I pointed out as a clear sign of a last-ditch attempt to signal for help, Miller barely glanced at it. Probably a drunk fight or a domestic dispute. Happens everywhere. They taped it up themselves so they wouldn't lose their security deposit. Honestly, a savvy move for renters. That comment, the sheer callous dismissal, snapped something inside me. It was terrifyingly clear. If the police and the building management could look at these obvious, violent signs and dismiss them as domestic squabbles or unfiled maintenance requests, Then the killer's genius wasn't in the act of the crime, but in the context. The killer understood the city's inherent apathy and bureaucratic shield. They knew that in this jungle of high-rise steel and glass, if you make your violence look like a minor paperwork error, no one will ever bother to break routine and truly investigate. The perfect crime was one that was rationally explained away before I even arrived. I looked from Miller's bored face to Evelyn's mechanical smile, and a cold certainty settled in my gut. I was now entirely alone. I had to prove that this was a war, not a maintenance issue, and the only evidence left was the victim's own terrifying final message,